Hey, all you wiretappers out there. Good to be back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins. I'm a retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective, later sergeant. I have this podcast, Gangland Wire. I've got a website. If you want to go check my website out, I got a few things for sale on there. And you can go rent the documentaries I've done about the Kansas City mob on Amazon. Just search my name. I'm all over the internet. Just search my name and mafia, and you'll find more than you ever wanted to know about me and the mob and what I've done. And today I have a former Kansas City boy, a Kansas City native who has done several books on the mob, particularly the Kansas City mob, and he's got a most recent one that I find just really fascinating. It's a little known story that will help shed the light on Jimmy Hoffa, a little bit more light than most of you ever knew. There's some questions that I had myself that's not really in the popular culture about Jimmy Hoffa. It's Frank Hayde. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Gary. Great to be with you again.
All right, Frank, we've done Mafia Dreams and Mafia and the Machine. So tell the guys a little bit about yourself and your books.
I grew up in Kansas City. My family stretches way back in Kansas City, and they were involved in the political machine under Pendergast. And so I heard a lot of stories about those days growing up. Later in my career with the National Park Service, I worked a short stint at the Harry Truman National Historic Site, where I learned more about local history, more about the political machine and the mob in Kansas City. So that's where my interest started. And then many years later, I wrote The Mafia and the Machine, and then followed that up with some of these other books, including this most recent one, Hoffa's Connection, the story of Sylvia Pagano, the Kansas City girl at the center of the Mafia's alliance with the Teamsters Union. That's a mouthful, I know. But you know how it is with a subtitle. You try to get the
Yeah,
summarize the entire book in your
yeah,
subtitle. So
yeah.
that's what
It's
that
hard to do.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's when you look up a book or you see it online or whatever, you want to know quickly what it's about. So I see that title, Hoffa. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I
Right.
thought everything was done about Hoffa. And
Yeah.
then you got this
Right.
subtitle in here and you say, oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Now, I didn't know
Yes.
about this. And I didn't myself, this Sylvia Pagano. And it's the story starts in Kansas City. It's a fascinating story, guys. I want to tell you, it is a fascinating story. But before we get started, Frank was a park ranger, a law enforcement park ranger for the National Park Service for 20 years. And he has a really interesting mob interaction when he was in, I believe you were on a temporary assignment out in California. Tell the guys about your
Uh,
mafia
Yeah.
interaction as a law enforcement officer.
Yeah. So I was actually with the Park Service 32 years. 20 of those were law enforcement and just retired. But in the summer of 2024, I got to go out to Redwood National Park on what we call a detail, which is a temporary assignment. They were shorthanded and needed a little extra help. And I knew the place pretty well because I had worked there earlier in my career. So I went out there, and it's a beautiful place. And I was on patrol, and I came upon a campsite, and there was some violations going on, nothing major, just the typical stuff that we see as park rangers. And I contacted the occupants of this campsite, and I got their licenses, and I was back in my vehicle running the licenses. There was a male and a female, and the female, I noticed it was a New York license and a Brooklyn address and the last name is Scarpa. I said, no, that can't be. That'd be too much of a coincidence. And ran the information, recontacted the subject, and I asked the female, I said, by any chance, are you related to Greg Scarpa? She said, oh, yeah, that was my grandfather. And Greg Jr. was my father. And I just had to laugh. And by then I had already written a ticket or two, I think, for just petty offenses. And so I handed her ticket and then asked her if she'd take a picture with me. But she was real nice. She understood people don't mind. And she was great.
Interesting.
Took a
Yeah.
picture with me, and she was more than happy to talk about her father and her grandfather. And it was all very interesting and just
Yeah.
quite the coincidence.
Yeah, really. Yeah, that was quite a coincidence. Not only the main coincidence instance was that you knew her, and then a lot of people might know the name,
Right.
really knew the name
Yeah,
and
no.
you had this whole interest in it. Talk about
Yeah, I can tell you that
worlds colliding.
99% of park rangers
Yeah,
would have
wouldn't
no idea. Now, if you're a Brooklyn
really.
cop, that's different, but
Yeah.
I was probably the only park ranger alive that would have made that connection because of
Yeah.
my interest in the topic. Yes.
Really, I've been trying to get Greg Scarpet Jr. to come on. He's made some intimations to somebody else. He followed my Facebook group, and I followed his, and so I don't know. I reached out indirectly. I don't know exactly how to get hold of him. Maybe I'll package this little story up and I'll send that to him. Maybe that'll get him to come on the show. Except you wrote the tickets, damn it.
That's the problem. I hope he won't come after me for writing his daughter a ticket.
Yeah. All right, Frank. So let's go in this most recent book, Hoffa's Connection. Sylvia Pagano, how did you even get onto that name other than, did you start? Yeah, she's Chucky O'Brien's mother, who
Correct.
most guys know if you're really into Hoffa at all, or even on the little bit. Chucky O'Brien everybody thought he was like his illegitimate son a lot of times, or his surrogate son. And he was really close to Hoffa and drove him around. I was going through your book. He was a guy that Hoffa could send around to other mob people because he was half Italian himself, and both sides trusted him to carry messages and do meetings and things like that. So how did you get onto this originally?
So I got a call from Jack Goldsmith, who's a very interesting man because he is the learned hand professor of law at Harvard University, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, former assistant attorney general under President Bush. But for me, the most interesting thing about him was that he is Chucky O'Brien's stepson. And he was working on his book, In Hoffa's Shadow, when he contacted me. It's a great book. I would recommend it to all the wiretappers. But it's about Chucky. And he wanted to know if I had come across any information on Chucky O'Brien in my research for the Mafia and the Machine, because Chucky was from Kansas City. I said, what? Chucky O'Brien was from Kansas City? Because I knew all about Chucky O'Brien, but I had no idea he was from Kansas City. So that shocked me. And I don't think very few people knew that. His Kansas City roots were scarcely known. Everybody just thought of Chucky as a Detroit guy. But when I finally read Goldsmith's book, it's about Chucky, but he touches on Sylvia. And I found what he wrote about Sylvia to be completely fascinating, especially because she was Kansas City. And so I thought, shoot, she's in my wheelhouse. I thought, wow, she would make a great subject for a book. But I balked at it because she was so secretive that she left hardly any documents exist about Sylvia. It's just, she wasn't like the men that she associated with who were so extensively documented. There was just very little known about her, not even very many photographs in existence. But fortunately, I got together with Pat Faisal in Kansas City. He's a terrific researcher. You've worked with him a lot, Gary. You've had him on your show, I think. He's written a couple of really important books on local history. And he had come across her independently of me, and through his own research, he had stumbled on just a brief mention or two of Sylvia Pagano in various FBI documents. And so we decided to put our heads together, and Pat helped me with the research, did the lion's share of the research, fed it to me, and then I would write the story. And that's how it came together.
Interesting. And Frank, one of the coolest things, the research that Pat found was those wiretaps or bugs that the illegal bugs the FBI had in her house. And so they got a lot of really great conversations, and they're all transcribed and out there for somebody to find. So to me, that was fascinating.
Yes, that was probably our best source, are these transcripts from the illegal microphones that the FBI placed in homes and businesses of organized crime associates all over the country back in the 60s. Got some great information from those. Sylvia talking freely in her apartment, candidly, because she doesn't know anybody's listening. Yeah. And they had him in Tony Giacaloni's Home Juice Company in Detroit also. And Sylvia was often a topic of conversation over there as well. And by the way, Tony Giacaloni was Sylvia's paramour for many years. They had a long affair. People who think that Sylvia had an affair with Hoffa that produced Chucky O'Brien, that is not accurate. We know who Chucky's father was. He was a criminal out of St. Louis from the time he was a boy, and went to prison when he was a young guy, was recruited from prison to come to Kansas City and work as a driver for none other than Charlie Banaggio. And so that put him right at the center of the action. And Sylvia, having married the young man, that put her right. She was already at the center of the action because she knew all the movers and shakers in the North End at that time already, from the time she was a girl. But they became very much a part of Banaggio's network. And this was one fact that really blew me away that I didn't know, and I don't think you know it, or Owsley or O'Malley, or really anybody in Kansas City, that Charlie Banaggio was Chucky O'Brien's godfather.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So Sylvia Pagano, she lives down there in the North End, what we call the North End, folks, which is our Little Italy. There's a big church that anchors that neighborhood, and that's where all the people came from Southern Italy and so Sicily, moved into Kansas City and were associated with the church down there. After them, the Vietnamese came in, and the church sponsored a lot of the Vietnamese and settled in that same neighborhood as it became a shifting neighborhood. So she's down over there in Little Italy, or the North End, and she meets a guy named Michael. Was it Three Fingers?
Oh, yeah.
Tell
Frankie.
it, tell
Frankie Three Fingers.
Frankie Three Fingers. Well, said I forgot the
Coppola.
last name. Coppola, yeah. So tell
Yeah.
us about that relationship.
Yeah, that's really interesting because Frankie Three Fingers hasn't really been chronicled much as part of the Kansas City family.
Yeah.
Because he was a roving guy, he had a lot of clout in both Italy and the US, and he had memberships in multiple families, and he was a high-ranking status too. So wherever he went, whether it was Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, St. Louis, New York, New Orleans, he was all over the place, and he was well respected wherever he went. But he was in Kansas City for quite a long time. He was strongly associated with Banaggio, and it appears from all the evidence, as well as testimony from organized crime experts in Detroit, that Frankie Three Fingers escorted Sylvia to Detroit after her marriage with Charles O'Brien ended in about 1941 in Kansas City. So Sylvia arrives in Detroit on the arm of Frank Coppola, and that put her on the fast track to getting to know the upper echelon of the Detroit family and mobsters, top mobsters beyond Detroit. Coppola was associated with Costello in his slot machine racket down in New Orleans. And later, after he got deported back to Italy, he worked with Lucky Luciano to put together the whole narcotics syndicate network that included the French Connection. So tremendously influential as a mobster. Sylvia could really not have picked a more influential and well-connected guy as a boyfriend. That really put her on the fast track to getting to know a lot of the most powerful guys in the country. Really interesting guy, Frank Coppola.
Yeah.
I'll just say it, and maybe someone else can run with it. I don't know if it'll be me or not, but he would make a great subject for a book.
Yeah. He's not very well known. And the mob used to have these guys, Nikolai Gentile. He traveled around to different families and brokered different deals. I think back before communication was so fast and you didn't fly from one city to the other, you had to take a train. That's a whole day on the train to get from one city to the other. Telephone communication wasn't that good. You didn't hardly make long distance phone calls back there in the 20s and 30s. I don't think they were hard. So you have guys like this that then travel around and take messages and are trusted by the different cities. And so he had to be one of those guys.
You're exactly right. In fact, he knew Nicola Gentili, and Gentili is also, I speak about him in this book also. He plays a role, a pretty important one, and he describes some events that are really fascinating. This story actually doesn't begin in Kansas City. It begins in Pueblo, Colorado. There's three geographic areas that are really emphasized in this story: Pueblo, Colorado, Kansas City, and Detroit. But Nicola Gentili and Frank Coppola knew each other in the United States, and they knew each other in Italy. And you're exactly right. They had a similar role as traveling diplomats within the mafia. Very interesting. Not too many other guys, especially later on. They had Johnny Roselli, who was really well traveled, and some others. But in those early days, a couple of these guys, Coppola, Gentili, I don't know if there was any others or not, but that was what they did. They were all over the place, and they were so well connected, and they really had memberships in multiple families, and that seems to have faded away later. You didn't hear too much about guys that had more than one member. So occasionally, somebody would switch families. But yeah, they're really interesting, real what you would call international mystery men, I think.
Interesting. So she had an affair with him, and he brought her up to Detroit and started making connections in Detroit, if I remember the story right, with
Correct.
the Jackalones. And so take us on from there. How does she then move in with Hoffa? And then she's like in the middle between the Peckerwood truck drivers and the
Right.
Italian mob, which
Yeah.
they both needed each other and they worked well together for a long time. So how did she end up in the center of that?
Yeah, she's still quite young when she gets to Detroit. She's just early 20s, maybe mid 20s at that point. And here she is, she's immediately meeting all the wise guys. But she was still, she needed a job. She needed work. I'm sure Coppola helped her out to some extent, but he had his own wife. He probably had another mistress or two as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
one for each city.
she needed to make a living and raise her son, Chucky. And she got a job with the Teamsters. At that time in Detroit, unions were strong. There was a lot of unions, and it was the capital of industrial unionism at that time. And so that just became a natural choice. She ended up meeting Burt Brennan initially, actually, even before Hoffa. Brennan was Hoffa's right-hand guy. And he gave her a job with the Teamsters as a salter. She was an organizer and a good one and a legit organizer, but her specialty was salting, where
Now, what's that?
she was a union representative, and she would get a job in a factory or a warehouse, just an ordinary job. And she would go to work just like everybody else, punch the clock. But while she was there, her real objective was signing other people up to join the union. So she's like a secret agent in a way, buried into the normal workforce, but with a different agenda. And she was real good at it. And the union guys noticed that she worked really hard, and that she was loyal, and that she was also that she would keep her mouth shut. And so those were the same qualities that the mob guys admired. So this was at the time, though, and this is very important, when most of the unions and the mob were still at odds with each other. Back then, the gangsters were getting hired by companies to break strikes and to oppose unions. And there was a particularly bad strike going on. It lasted a long time. The Teamsters were striking the Detroit Lumber Company. This was at about 42. And it was violent. And Hoffa could see the writing on the wall that the Teamsters were losing the battle. It went on and on. It was violent. And that's where Sylvia Pagano stepped in. Burt Brennan told Jimmy Hoffa he should talk to Facci. Facci was Italian for face, and that was Sylvia's nickname that she got when she was young back in Kansas City. Had a very pretty face, and so they called her the Face. So Hoffa talked to Facci, and she set up basically like a summit meeting, peace conference more or less, and they brokered a deal where the mob switched sides and became allies with the Teamsters against the Detroit Lumber Company. So that was really the moment that changed history, brought the mafia into the Teamsters orbit and vice versa. And that's all traceable right back to Sylvia Pagano.
Wow. That's interesting. That I always wondered what the genesis of that was with Hoffa and the mob. And of course, we can see how it developed, but what that actual birth of that was.
Right.
I think you've stumbled across the birth of it. You also were able to stumble across the birth of the Eastern families, the New York families connection to Hoffa, which that gets even bigger. Tell us a little bit about that. She was involved in that, believe it or not, guys. And just like in Detroit, back in New York, there's Johnny Dio. He was busting up labor union strikes for the companies.
Yeah, I think that to some degree in New York, New Jersey, that some Teamsters locals had already been infiltrated by the mafia independently and maybe unbeknownst to Hoffa in
Yeah.
Detroit. But it really became a big thing with Hoffa and with Sylvia's brokering that alliance. Little isolated examples of mob infiltration, I think, were already happening in Detroit. But once again, as Hoffa's progressing in his career, moving up the ranks, he always had his eye on the top job. He wanted to be the president of the IBT. And of course, he knew he needed help in the Northeast for that, to realize that goal. And so, with Sylvia, helped set up meetings with Tony Ducks Corallo, Johnny Diaguardi, Tony Provenzano. And Sylvia had gotten to know Provenzano in Detroit because he had strong connections to Detroit. Let's see, his cousin was married to
Tony
Tony
Pro. Yeah.
Giacalone.
Tony
Yeah,
Giacalone's cousin was
yeah,
married to Tony Pro, I believe, or vice
that's what
versa.
it,
Yeah.
that
I
you're
read that in
that's
your
it.
book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and read my own book just to make
Yeah.
sure
It's hard to keep up.
hard to remember all the
All
details.
these
Yeah, but
players.
so,
Yeah. All
so
these players.
Giacalone's cousin was married to Provenzano, and so
Yeah.
Sylvia had already met Provenzano in Detroit, and Chucky, her son, had already started calling him Uncle Tony, and so she had this great connection to Provenzano, and so she helped facilitate the Teamsters mob alliance in New York and New Jersey, just as she had in Detroit. And then it goes on from there. Then she later, we're moving forward now, but she would later become the link between Hoffa and his closest contact in Cleveland, which was Mo Dalitz. She became the link between Hoffa and Alan Dorfman in Chicago. And she became the link between Hoffa and the Sevilla brothers in Kansas City. So she really was, and this is all they talk. There's a from those FBI tapes, those illegal FBI tapes. We have Tony Zerilli and Nick Sevilla in Florida speaking about Sylvia Pagano and her relationship as a liaison between the Detroit family and between the Kansas City family. There's your proof right there. Not that you needed it. She was really, the guys, a lot of them really adored her in the sense of she did have an affair with a couple of them, and she was a good looking woman. A lot of them had, Mo Dalitz was known to have a crush on Sylvia, possibly an affair with Sylvia, but she was more than your mob mole, right? She was a deal maker. She was an advisor. She was a liaison. She brought money to the table. She did deals with the guys. She helped broker some pension fund loans, all these things. So what I like to say about Sylvia is that we all know that the mob never inducted women into their ranks, but if they had, Sylvia Pagano would have been their first choice because she worked hard, she was loyal, she kept her mouth shut, and she really lived truer to the code than some of the men did. She was 100% omerta. She really was. And she learned that in the north end of Kansas City, where omerta was extremely strong, even up into this century after it wasn't so strong in other places. And so she passed that on to Chucky O'Brien. He was also a real strong adherent to the code of silence.
Yeah, I think we have to remember Chucky O'Brien was half Italian. His father was
Right.
Italian, and so he
No.
wasn't he?
So his mother Sylvia was the Italian.
Mother Sylvia,
Yeah,
but
his dad was Irish.
yeah, I got that mixed up exactly, ass backwards. But yeah, he was half Italian, and so he really talked the talk, and he moved right in. All these guys were like his uncle, Uncle Nick,
Yeah.
Uncle Cork, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So he came back to Kansas City. Tell a little bit about Chucky
Right.
O'Brien in Kansas City.
Yeah, so in 1950, he'd been in Detroit for about 9 years by that point. 1950, he's getting into high school age, and Sylvia sent him back to Kansas City to live on Independence Avenue with his grandparents. And he went to Cardinal Glennon High School and became a good athlete. Started dating a gal from the old neighborhood who was a lot like Sylvia. I think that's really interesting because Chucky really idolized his mother, but he never really, when he was young at least, got to spend as much time with her as he wanted. He spent a lot of time back in Kansas City. He spent a time at his uncle's house in Detroit because Sylvia was so busy with Hoffa and with the mob. But so here's Chucky in Kansas City. He meets a gal from Sylvia's old neighborhood who has other things in common with Sylvia and who even looks, in my opinion, quite a lot like Sylvia. And he would eventually take her back to Detroit and marry her and have a family together. But his main objective, it really in Kansas City, wasn't so much going to school. It was becoming a truck driver. He wanted to become a truck driver so that he could put himself on the path to becoming a union organizer like his hero and surrogate father, Jimmy Hoffa. And according to Chucky, Uncle Nick and Uncle Cork got him his first job as a driver and got him his first union card with Local 541. And this was right at the time when Local 541 was becoming ground zero for labor strife and union corruption in the United States. And Gary, you said a key word earlier, which was Peckerwood. And that's who was running the Kansas City Teamsters at the time. It was dominated by Peckerwood guys, country boys, basically, and like Hoffa. And these guys were just as bad as the Italian gangsters who were more famous. They ran those locals with intimidation and terror, and they were violent, and they were very ambitious. They had political power. Make a long story short, in 1953 in Kansas City, we had an inter-union labor war, and it was the Teamsters versus almost every other union in town. And Teamsters were trying to dominate a lot of these other unions, is what it was. And so you had a complete paralysis of the entire construction industry for 3 months. Imagine just all construction stopping for 3 months in any metro area and how devastating that is to the economy. 23,000 Kansas Cityans were out of work. Teamsters were refusing to pick up or deliver supplies. And that eventually morphed into violence and sabotage. You had guys going into battle at construction sites. People were getting badly injured. People were getting kidnapped. And then furthermore, we had 4 military defense projects centered in the Kansas City area. And this is right at the height of the Korean War. So these military installations were suffering work stoppages also. So this was unacceptable in Washington. And Congress swooped in with hearings and an investigation. And they called this, basically, I think the exact language was something like the most forbidding chapter in the history of American unions, something like that. It was a big deal. This history has been mostly forgotten, but Kansas City was completely paralyzed for about 3 months. And that was the union, that was the local, primarily Local 541, which Chucky was a young member of. He was too young at that time to get drawn into the politics of the union. I don't believe that he was on the front lines of these battles and violence that was happening. He was just a brand new truck driver at the time. But he was part of that in the sense that he was a member of the local at the time this stuff was happening. So yeah, that's what happened when Chucky came back to Kansas City.
Interesting. And that must have been the time when Roy Williams started moving up the ladder and the mob was moving in, and he moved this auto ring and some of his people out, and Roy Lee Williams must have, with the support of Nick Savella and the local mob, must have moved right on in.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. The main guy behind all the strife and violence I was just talking about was Orville Ring, classic quintessential Peckerwood guy. And then after all this happened, Hoffa swooped in and helped negotiate an end to these conflicts in 1953. And Nick Savella and his crime family, they were all watching all this from the wings, planning and scheming. Wow, there's a lot going on here. How can we capitalize on this? So in the aftermath of it all, the Savellas basically intimidated Orville Ring out of the union. He went back to his farm. Later, he was killed in an accident on his farm, which a lot of people thought was the mob did it, but it looked probably just an accident. I think a tractor rolled over on him or something like that. But yeah, Roy Williams. So at this time, just basically the Italians were taking over from the Peckerwoods.
Yeah.
There were still some useful Peckerwoods, and they worked together. And Roy Williams was the key guy there. This is when Nick Savella and he started working together to take over the Teamsters in Kansas City. You're exactly right. and
Yeah.
the rest is history.
No, really. Roy Williams is an interesting guy. He was a war hero from World War II.
Yeah.
He had several Bronze Stars, and he was a huge war hero. But he knew which side of the bread got the butter, and so he went with that, and he went with
Yeah.
Nick Savella, and he did. He bucked up to him a few times, but Nick Savella, actually, in a famous scene, Nick Savella had him picked up and driven somewhere and shined a bright light in his eyes and said, "You will go along with this scheme."
Yeah.
So but he kept going along till he did become the president of the union for a short period of time, almost right there at the end of his life, and when everybody was going to jail. But
Yeah.
he was Nick Savella's protege and Nick Savella's puppet for his whole life, and the whole Teamsters Union was.
Yeah, and that story you mentioned with the white spotlight shining in his eyes, they kidnapped him and took him into this empty warehouse. And I always point to that as just one of those terrifying stories about how the mob used to work. And
Yeah.
man, and that wasn't the only time that they intimidated Roy Williams in that manner. So he, like you said, he was this tough guy, war hero, and he was a big guy, and yet even a guy like that can get intimidated into doing whatever these guys tell him to do, because his tactics that they used were just terrifying.
Yeah, I read one thing where later on he claimed, when he turned and gave evidence and talked to the Bureau, that he claimed that they also threatened his wife and children during one of these sit downs with him. And they did the same thing to Alan Glick out in Las Vegas. Tuffy DeLuna was out there, and he read off Alan Glick's name of his wife and his children, says, "You may find yourself expendable, but I don't think you're going to find your family expendable," and read off their names. So there's two good examples of them. Say the mob never messes with your family. There's two good examples of them using the family and family as threats.
Yeah.
It's
scary
crazy
stuff.
Yeah, it is. I heard knowing Mo Dalitz, that was to me, that was like key, because he was such a mover and an operator. Talk a little more about that. He had to be in Cleveland. He had to set her up with Bill Presser, and that was primarily Jewish mobsters in Cleveland, seemed to me like. And then he also had all those connections to Chicago to get to Red Dorfman, his son Alan Dorfman. Talk a little more about that relationship with Mo Dalitz.
Yeah, in Mo Dalitz's biography, I can't think of the name of the author at the moment, but that author states that Sylvia was one of Mo Dalitz's lovers. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I do think that Mo Dalitz, at the very least, had a crush on Sylvia, but also respected her very much. And she, just as she had with the Detroit family before, she brokered an alliance with Dalitz. What happened was Dalitz had a laundry empire. He was a rum runner and a racketeer and a leader in the Jewish mob, but he also had a lot of legitimate businesses, including a laundry empire in Detroit and Cleveland. And while he was still in Detroit, before he really made his move to Cleveland, his permanent move to Cleveland, his laundries, along with other laundry owners, they bonded together in an association. And they were very anti-union, and they were basically at odds with the Teamsters. And until Sylvia swooped in, and Sylvia had her own connections by now to the Laundry Workers Union also. So she's working for the Teamsters, and she's very close to Hoffa, but she then married a guy named John Paris, who was the head of the Laundry Workers Union. So Sylvia knows Hoffa, and she knows the head of the Laundry Workers Union very closely, and she knows Dalitz. So she's the one who's positioned to bring these people together, sit them down at the same table, and start working together, start negotiating. And that's what she did with Dalitz. And so that led to Dalitz paying off Hoffa, basically, to settle this contract on terms that were favorable to Dalitz and the other laundry owners. You could say that Hoffa, in that case, sold out his members, at least at that time. Now, I do want to make it clear that most rank and file Teamsters for many decades loved Hoffa, because he definitely did negotiate some great contracts that brought truck drivers into the middle class, got them very good pay and benefits, And it's only fair, it's only right to give him credit, because as somebody once said about Hoffa, he was always a criminal, but also always a teamster. And he worked very hard for his membership. He never stopped working. And it was sincere, I do believe. But there were times when the ends justified the means, and he did whatever he had to do to keep the union alive, but also to serve himself and enrich himself. And that was one of those cases where the membership lost out a little bit when Hoffa and Dalitz formed their alliance with the initiation and the help of Sylvia Pagano.
Interesting. So let's go back to Chucky O'Brien for a minute. He goes back up from Kansas City. He ends up back up in Detroit and working really closely with Jimmy Hoffa. And you talked to his son.
Yeah.
Into making that. And he was probably a huge help and some insight into what his father was like. So talk about Chucky O'Brien when he got back with Hoffa.
Yeah, so he goes back to Detroit, and he steps right back into the Hoffa family circle, because Sylvia became part of the Hoffa family. She was Josephine Hoffa's best friend. Jimmy Hoffa relied on her not only for important work in the union and for important connections to the mob, but he also relied on her heavily as Josephine's personal assistant and caretaker. Sylvia worked extremely hard serving other people, and she was an excellent caretaker to Josephine, who needed a lot of care, had very poor health, made worse by severe alcoholism. And Sylvia was a wonderful caretaker. But Chucky stepped right back into that family orbit. Later, when his own kids were small, Chucky and his wife and his kids moved into the Hoffa house. They all lived under the same roof for quite a few years. But Sylvia was really the glue that kept it all together. And Chucky's son, who's also named Chuck O'Brien, he was a young boy at this time. So his memories of his grandmother and Jimmy Hoffa started when he was a young boy and continued up until Sylvia died when he was in his late teens. But he was a great source for the book, helped out a lot. I really appreciate him. And it was interesting to have direct access to someone who actually lived under the same roof with Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah.
He was not privy, young Chuck was not privy to any inside information or any mob dealings or anything like that. But he later moved to Kansas City and went to work in the River Key for his uncle at the Godfather Lounge, which just a couple of years later was torched in the River Key War. And then young Chuck had worked in professional hockey for a while. And then he became a truck driver and joined Local 41. And so it's all this history just comes full circle and repeats itself. And I was a little fascinated with these Sylvia's grandkids who were born and raised in Detroit. They both ended up back in Kansas City in the land of their parents and their grandparents. And they ended up in the same neighborhoods that Sylvia had been born in many years before.
Interesting. And Chucky O'Brien, then he's kind of Hoffa's driver sometimes and errand runner on up to the end of Hoffa's life, was even implicated at the very end. Some people claim that he helped set Hoffa up because he was the one person that Hoffa trusted. And that one movie, the Irishman or whatever, really threw a lot of shade on Chucky O'Brien. Yeah. So how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think Chucky got a real bad rap. And as I used to study Hoffa and read all the Hoffa books, I always had a very low opinion of Chucky O'Brien, and he became the butt of a joke, and he was portrayed as this blundering, not too bright guy who either helped kill his surrogate father or was duped into giving him a ride to where he was killed without knowing what was going on and without being able to realize it to the point where he could have maybe helped Hoffa. I think Jack Goldsmith put all that to rest. He really changed my opinion of Chucky in his book, and I realized that Chucky had been misunderstood in many ways. Was he involved in Hoffa's disappearance or not? I think Goldsmith basically vindicates Chucky. However, I do believe that there's still some evidence that could strongly suggest that even in light of what Goldsmith wrote, that Chucky could still have known more than he let on. But he was so committed to Omerta that he took a lot of secrets to his grave, I believe. And what's interesting is some of the other co-conspirators in the Hoffa thing ended up dead, like Sally Bugs, and got killed in Little Italy a few years later. And the prevailing wisdom, at least, was to keep him quiet about the Hoffa case. And they would have probably done the same thing to Chucky if Chucky could have pointed the finger at anybody or implicated anybody. And I'm sure he could have. I'm sure he knew some things about that. He was so close to Giacalone. Chucky was very close to Tony Giacalone and to Tony Provenzano. And I think that Chucky survived because Giacalone trusted him 100%. Just as Sylvia Pagano's son, Giacalone's trust in Chucky to not give anybody up was just so rock solid. And he loved Chucky. And I think that he was also honoring Sylvia by allowing Chucky to stay alive. So I know I'm straying from your initial question, Gary. There's so much going on with the whole Chucky O'Brien thing and his involvement. It gets very interesting. You have to get really down in the weeds with it to understand all of it. But I think that Goldsmith's book is a great read for anybody who's interested in Hoffa and the whole case. I definitely would recommend it.
So it may come down to Chucky O'Brien, and was he more loyal to the mob, to the mafia and their code, or more loyal to Hoffa and the Teamsters? Hoffa as an individual, not to the Teamsters Union, but Hoffa as an individual. Was he more loyal to Hoffa, or more loyal to the union, or more loyal to the mob? And giving up those guys, he has to turn his back on everything, the union and the mob. And so I can see where whatever he knew, he was not going to say a word. It would be to his advantage. They didn't have a hammer on him. Wasn't a criminal. They didn't have a life sentence hanging over his head for anything.
They did prosecute Chucky on a federal case. It was a small time thing. He took some gifts from an employer in his role as a union guy, some small gifts. And then he had also got caught up in a cargo theft case, which is all documented in the book, Office of Connection. But the law enforcement did have a couple of cases that they could apply pressure onto Chucky, but he didn't say a word, and he just went to prison and served his time. He didn't have to serve too much time. He was only in for about a year, I think. Yeah, it was a low-level felony, but he'd never thought once about turning state's witness. He just went and served his time and got back out and went on with his life.
Yeah, it's those 50 and 75-year sentences that'll make guys attorneys. You get even. I used to say when they came up those sentencing guidelines for cocaine dealers, you could make a guy talk about his mother when he's 40 years old and he's looking at a 50, 75-year sentence.
Yeah. I do have to say, though, if there's one guy that and there was a few of them who went and served hard time.
Yeah, long time till they're old.
Give anybody else up. And I think Chucky would have been one of those guys. I do. He, having been raised by Sylvia Pagano, he was just so committed to that culture and those traditions and that way of life and Omerta. Yeah. Sylvia even had almost a kind of a halfway making ceremony for Chucky. She arranged for the top guys in Detroit. When he came back to Detroit from Kansas City in the early 50s, Tony Giacalone put together a little event where Chucky walked into the back room of Grecian Gardens restaurant in Detroit, and all the top guys were sitting around a table, and he made a pledge of loyalty to them at that time. And then he sat down and broke bread with them, and it didn't prick his finger and burn a card, and he wasn't made into the family, but it was almost halfway a little bit. And they did that for Sylvia. And because they just valued her so much, they respected her and they needed her. She was the connection to their most valuable asset, which was Jimmy Hoffa. So that tells you a little bit about how much respect they had for Sylvia, and also for Chucky's unique role. Here he is. He's the son of Charlie Bonaggio's low-level chauffeur. Yeah. And yet he's sitting down with guys like Meyer Lansky in Florida. He's sitting down with all the top guys in Detroit, Chicago. He knew Accardo, Rica, Rosanova, all these top guys in Chicago. Then he would sit down with them on behalf of Jimmy Hoffa. I say in the book that he probably had more, Chucky O'Brien, the son of Benaggio's chauffeur, probably had more sit downs with high level mobsters than Nick Savella did. As Hoffa's representative, that was the life. And he knew how to handle that kind of thing because he was raised by Sylvia. So he knew how to say, what not to say, how to behave himself in those types of meetings. So that came naturally to him. And he was Hoffa's gopher. He drove him places. He took Hoffa's wife to her medical appointments. He did low-level stuff like that. But he also did more important work, more sensitive stuff, like sitting down with mob bosses and relaying information back and forth, just like as Sylvia had taught him to do. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I tell you what, guys, Frank Hayde, Hoffa's Connection, the story of Sylvia Pagano, the Kansas City girl at the center of the mafia's alliance with the Teamsters Union. Yeah, I'm going to have links in here. You better get this book. This is untrod territory, unplowed ground, as we used to say on the farm. This is fresh stuff that you've read. There's so many books out there about Hoffa and his disappearance that they just want to, come on, we can't do this again. I can't do this again, Hoffa's disappearance. You're never going to find his body. You're never going to figure out exactly who killed him. Nobody's going to talk, and anybody that could is dead. But this unearthed some really fresh, interesting information about Hoffa and his connection with the Italian La Cosa Nostra in the United States, the entire United States, really.
Yes, thank you, Gary. That was a very nice little summary of it, and I really appreciate you. You've had me on your show before, my other books, and I listen to your podcast. Can't get enough of it.
Yeah, well,
you do
good.
terrific. You do terrific work. We all us wiretappers love you, man, and we all appreciate you very much.
Thank you. Thank
you. Are you still doing are we still buying you cups of coffee and that kind of thing?
Yeah, you can always buy me a cup of coffee and hit the donate button. I forget about doing that. I've been doing this so long, and I got a few guys that hit it regularly, and some never do. I do this for the pure joy of it anyhow, but it helps to have a little extra money coming in now and then. It's when you were selling books yesterday, you loved writing this book. You love all that research and putting it together and educating people, but it's nice to get paid for it too.
It's a small-time racket, but hey.
It's our small-time racket. Another interesting thing, Frank, we were talking about people doing time, getting so much time and trying to force them to talk. Yesterday, Frank had a program at the library, and we had a local guy who was the subject of his last book, Mafia Dreams, who was a mob hanger-on guy when he was a young guy, and he got caught up in a murder, an accidental murder in a way that it's a long story, and you have to get Mafia Dreams to learn about it. The next generation of the wannabe Italian mafia guys in Kansas City. And so that guy was there. He did 25 years for what we call felony murder. Another guy, he transported a friend of his to a drug buy, only the guy killed the man who was selling or tried to kill the man that was selling the drugs, and the FBI had it set up and ran in and shot and killed the kid who Albanese had carried up to the drug ripoff. And so they charged this driver with felony murder, and he did 25 years, just got out about 4 or 5 years ago. He could have talked. He had enough to buy him a lot of grace on that 25-year sentence, and he did every word, every minute of it. He never said a word, and it was hard time. It was state time here in Missouri.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think he is representative of Kansas City in a way, because I do believe that in Kansas City, the Code of Omerta persisted longer than it did in most places. And when you're 24 years old, I think he was 24 at the time that he was sentenced. Maybe he was 25. And you get sentenced to 25 and a half years. And you have the chance to whittle that down by giving up information on your friends. And you don't take it, and you choose to do the 25 and a half years. That's hardcore. And he did, and those are the best years of his life that he'll never get back. But he is out now, and he's making a legitimate living, and keeping his nose clean, and just trying to make up for a lot of lost time.
Yeah, he is. And that's 25 years will straighten your mind out, won't it?
Yeah.
Man, a lot of time. All right, Frank. Thanks so much for coming
thanks
on
again,
the show.
Gary. Don't forget to donate. Buy Gary a cup of coffee, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay,
Frank. That was
Talk
great.
to you later.